Hi, so recently I was thinking about the set of circumstances that led me to playing World of Warcraft, and in particular playing it in a very serious way, realising there's several steps in my life that sort of led to it, any one of which wasn't there, and I wouldn't be playing this game now. And when I was looking at them and I was thinking about them, okay, so where did it all start? What led me to it? I noticed there were 6 distinct things, and this reminded me of the 6 degrees of separation. This is the idea that any 2 people on Earth are potentially separated by 6 steps of people. In other words, you know someone who knows someone who knows someone, blah, blah, blah. 6 people down the line. It can be anyone on Earth. The Queen of England, the President of the United States, the Chairman of the ruling party of China, whoever. Whether it's true or not, don't know. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to explain what my 6 steps to WoW are, any one of which, if it wasn't there, if I hadn't happened upon it, I probably wouldn't be playing World of Warcraft now. And then I'd like to put a challenge to you all. What are your 6 steps, or indeed however many steps there are, to you having played World of Warcraft that led you to it? Maybe share it with other people as well. Maybe some people have got some really interesting stories. So for me, the starting point is possibly going to be the starting point for a great many people. And this happened in my pre-teens days, I would say, when I was about 8 years old, and I read Tolkien's The Hobbit. And then I read it again and I loved it. And then I graduated onto Lord of the Rings. Now this was much heavier going, starting off with Fellowship of the Ring, of course. But I stuck at it and I sort of loved that book as well. And I particularly enjoyed the world that it was creating. You know, although I wasn't always, if I'm honest, bothered about especially the hobbits and the characters in it. But I was very interested in the world, and I started to imagine like adventures in that world myself, and started to be somewhat more interested in some of these side characters in it. And then shortly after that, I played a game, well, a few years later really, but I think it was very shortly after finishing The Lord of the Rings. I got a game, at the time I had an Atari ST computer, and I got a game called Dungeon Master. And I don't know, I suppose if you weren't about in the 80s, you wouldn't really know much about this. It would have very dated graphics and that would be terrible. People wouldn't stand to be able to play it now. But the idea with this one is it was a good old dungeon crawl, literally a dungeon crawl. There was level by level you descended down, and it got harder and harder. And you had a party of 4 characters who all went very blockily along, and you controlled all 4. And, you know, you had experience, you had different skill lines, and by competing in combat and using those skills, you leveled up. There was even the grind in there. There was the Screamer regeneration room, as it was called. There were these plant-like creatures, and there was a particular, and they're called Screamers because they screamed, but they dropped leaves which you could eat. You had to eat and drink, otherwise you would starve. And there was a particular room where they kept regenerating. So what you would do is you would kill them, and then you would actually pick up the fallen remains of the ones you just killed and lob them at the remaining ones to level up your ninja skill, I think it was at the time. And it led for me one of the biggest... I was so involved in it. I'll tell you what happens. There's a part in it very late on where there's actually a dragon right at the bottom, and it's a fearsome beastie. And I gave my save position to someone, a friend, for a week or so he could play a bit of it, and then, you know, he gave it me back, and I was carrying on. And unbeknownst to me, he'd sort of kited the dragon into this room and sealed it off so that he could go and explore and loot that sort of lair. So I didn't know this, and I opened the door to where it was, not expecting it to be there at all. I thought it was off in its little lair over to my left, and suddenly this dragon was right in my face. And it's the only time I've ever in a game actually jumped out of my seat. I fell out of my seat with utter shock. But this game I played so much. I played such a long time. I played it over and over again with different characters, choosing different characters as well. And it really had a big impression on me, to the point where when I was introduced to another game, a much more famous game, and one that, you know, a great many people of my age, you would think it really introduced them to role-playing games, would be Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It was Dungeons and Dragons, I think, the 3rd edition, if memory serves. And I was introduced to this, and ordinarily I might not have treated it seriously at all, but because of my enjoyment of Dungeon Master, I was all up for trying this out. And actually, the first character I chose was a mage, but I only did that because the typical archetype, there were 5 of us exactly. It was quite natural for a party of 4 in Dungeons and Dragons to have like a wizard, a thief, a cleric, and like a fighter type character, because then you would have all the skills you needed. But I think, the person who introduced me to this could sort of tell that I wasn't it was like, it's all right. But the character that really interested me was the paladin, and I can't tell you why. But it is, of course, the reason why I really wanted to play paladin when World of Warcraft came out. But my feeling at the time was, well, it's a bit of a, just I suppose it's the attitude people had in WoW for many years. It's a bit of a support class. It doesn't do anything brilliantly. And it's which one are you going to remove for it? And they basically told me, because this was the beauty of AD&D, the Dungeon Master can massage things and make things work. You play what you want, they said. So I played the Paladin. Absolutely loved it. It was called Thete. The reason for that is I can remember, but I'm not going to go through it now. But, and that's, of course, what my character is now called. It all stems from them. Oh, well, about 30 years ago? Was it about 30? Round about that. But I didn't get to play very much. People introduced it to me to. I only really saw it at summertime because they didn't live in my town. But I used to go back and just play it a little bit, only very casually. And then many years later, I actually got the books myself. And although never actually got into a group to play it properly again, did really enjoy reading them. Again, you could tell with the lore of that. Again, this is why it's so important, that Tolkien step at the start. Very much inspired by Tolkien. Many of these role-play game systems are, including World of Warcraft. But this one much more so. But there was so much else to it as well. You could sort of tell these guys were inspired by Tolkien, but wanted to create their own world. And this is sort of what I get from World of Warcraft as well, and any other of the RPGs I've played. You can definitely see the influence of Tolkien in it, but then they take it on themselves and they go in a different direction and they do their own thing. And so, yeah. And then the next one, for which I did get into a group with a group of friends from school, it was a board game, a role-playing game, was HeroQuest. And this was brought out by Games Workshop, who produce Warhammer and 40k. And they, I think, had introduced it specifically to get people into it, because playing Warhammer or 40k is a very involved hobby. You can't just buy a set and go with it. So this was an idea, I think, where everything would be in a box for you to play one of their games. And I did, and so I loved HeroQuest as well. And in fact, it inspired me with another friend from school to actually create our own role-playing game. We created our own with our own system. I made maps and we created like a whole combat system, things like that, and then got some guinea pigs to play it out one summer. And also, it got me interested in reading around the lore on it. So I would go into a Games Workshop and I would buy the army books, not to learn how to play the game, but just to read the background. This game, even more so than AD&D, got me really interested in not just the mechanics of the game, but actually the lore, the background. It really got me interested for the first time since reading Tolkien stuff in the world that a fantasy setting was. And the next game, and you might think this was the 6th step into World of Warcraft, but it wasn't. This was the 5th step. A friend of mine from school, I went round and he had a PC. I didn't have a PC at the time. I still had my Atari ST. And he had a PC. And I used to play a few games with him on it. And that included like Dave the Tentacle and stuff like that. And then one day it was Warcraft. And my introduction to RTS as well. And it was absolutely brilliant. I loved the humour in it. I absolutely loved the humour. From an RTS point of view, I've not always been taken with them. I didn't, for example, enjoy Command and Conquer, which I can't remember if that came out later, actually. But I know I'd played Warcraft before Command and Conquer, and when I played that, didn't like that so much. But I loved Warcraft. And a lot of it partly was the fantasy setting. I've always been more interested in playing fantasy games than sci-fi games, even though I love sci-fi to watch it as a film or read it in books. But I think the other thing was the humour. Like when you're playing the orcs, and I loved playing the orcs, you know, just poking the peon, and you go, what? You poke him again, what? And you keep doing it, and he would get irritated, go, stop poking me. And I absolutely loved it, because it was this friend I played with as well. It was really, because he was a very aggressive one. He would go out very quickly and try to get an initial advantage. I was much more cautious and would build a defensive base first. I would be protect and then explore type of person. So it was a really good contrast that often led to really good battles between us. And I played that for quite some time, and eventually Warcraft. I wasn't so keen on Warcraft 2, but Warcraft 3 and so on. And then, but that was years later. But at the Warcraft stage, yeah, I played that with him until I went to university. Now, he'd actually joined me in the same city at university, but that was a year later. He went a year after me because he went to art college first. So I was there and making new friends and stuff like that. And in that first year, I met someone who was very much into what is my sixth step before World of Warcraft, which is Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So graduating from the Warhammers like HeroQuest and Advanced HeroQuest to actually Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And he was talking to me about this because we got talking about it because he'd caught me reading the Skaven Army book. Again, I was reading it for lore purposes, and he thought I played it, but I didn't. But he was mad keen on it, and he was talking about it, and I wasn't interested in playing it. I didn't think I would enjoy it. I'd been used to playing the small dungeon crawler games. So with like 4 adventurers, like whether it was in Dungeon Master or HeroQuest, or even Dungeons and Dragons, I was used to these small dungeon crawling groups, not the vast armies thing. I didn't think that would be as interesting. So, I was very skeptical about it, and he persuaded me. He eventually got me in by saying that he had a friend who had a Skaven army, and I could play against one of his armies, and his friend would be quite happy for me to use one of his Skaven armies. So I had a quick read of the rule book. He lent me one weekend, and then I used my army book to plan an army, an absolute totally rubbish army, I'm sure. And then the following week we did actually have a game, and the good thing about Skaven, it's so much fun, because it's very much like playing gnomes, but without the annoyance factor. Because their stuff is either, or it was at the time, really awesome or really disastrous and would actually wipe out your own army. And it did. I basically wiped out my own army with a doom wheel that went completely haywire. But I had so much fun with it, and it was totally different to what I was expecting. I was expecting a lot of boring, moving bits of infantry forwards here and there, but it was such good fun. And before we realised the game had taken a good 2.5, 3 hours. And I thought, this is fantastic. So I got very interested in that. And when I left university, I started to get some bits, because I'd been cut off from the people whose models I could use. So I started to get a few of my own. I got a few friends involved in it as well, one of whom now works at Games Workshop as an illustrator. And that went on for some time. I mean, that was then my main hobby. And I think Warhammer Fantasy Battle was the first game I played almost to the exclusion of everything else. In other words, it became my main hobby. And I went to tournaments, and the grand tournament in their headquarters twice a year while they were doing that. And then something came along which made me stop immediately. Not get weaned off it, not sort of turned away, but just completely stopped me dead. Now, at this point, I'd had Warcraft 3, I'd played Warcraft 3, I'd enjoyed that, I'd loved the storyline of that, particularly the Arthur storyline. And I knew that World of Warcraft was being made because I sort of followed it in the news. But again, didn't appeal to me. I thought, this idea of MMO, I knew what the internet was like. I'd been on forums. Do I really want to be in a world full of like basically forum trolls? I didn't think it sounded like a very sociable experience to me, an MMO. And so I didn't even think about getting it, even though I'd loved the Warcraft games and I'd loved the stories. And then couple of months after it came out in Europe, because it came out in Europe several months after it did in North America. A friend of mine who was living with him at the time had it, and he said, "You should get this. It's really good." And again, I'd been so hesitant, but I think the thing that sort of got me thinking, well, maybe I will enjoy it, is because at the time, remember, I was very much into Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and I had been hesitant to get into that, and I'd been turned around like that. I just immediately, you know, all my sort of qualms about it were completely unfounded, and I ended up loving it. And I thought, well, maybe this will be the same thing. So I thought about it for a second. I thought, well, and I said to him, can you play a paladin? Thinking back to Warcraft 3. And he said, yes. And I said, okay, I'll get it. And the next day after work, went to town, bought myself a copy, put it on. And the rest is almost history from there. So I did love it pretty much straight away. It was no real effort to get into it. And 12 years later, here we are. So those are my 6 steps to World of Warcraft. Any one of which, I reckon, if it hadn't have happened, I would not be playing this game now. So what are your 6 steps to playing World of Warcraft? And can you spin an interesting tale about them? Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.